This morning we're going to continue our study at looking at the Bible for biblical wisdom when it comes to our major decisions. The book that we're going to look at in order to find examples of following biblical wisdom in the midst of major decisions is the book of Esther. Because I think in the story we have multiple characters that are making major decisions. Unfortunately, some of the people that are making these major decisions in life make some really, really bad ones. And a few other characters make some really good decisions. But I think this morning it would benefit us the most to look at both the good decisions and what motivated those good decisions and the bad decisions so that we can learn from both. In chapter 1, King Xerxes has a banquet. And in this banquet, he invites all the people of his cabinet, all of his officials and nobles to this banquet. Although we see that this king is detestable and immoral, and he calls his wife to do something immoral, and she refuses, so he puts away her. He divorces her. He gets rid of her and starts to look for a new queen. In chapter 2, Esther becomes queen. Xerxes has a banquet, has a pageant in order to find out who's the most beautiful and who he wants in the kingdom. And he chooses, out of all these women, he chooses Esther to become queen. But there's one thing about Esther that he did not know. What he did not know about Esther was that she was a Jew. But that at the time did not matter to the king. The king did not try to find out who her family was because he was so focused on falling in love with Esther. We see how much he loves her and appreciates her and how committed he becomes to her, much more committed than he was to his previous wife. But then in chapter 3, we learn of this man named Haman and how he hates Jews. Not only does he hate Jews, but he hates the family of the Jews, including Mordecai, and he plots to kill the Jews. He was a Canaanite, and from his family line, when looking back at his family, the Jews killed his family and destroyed them. And then they took their land of which God had promised them. But God destroyed their land and destroyed their people because they were wicked, because they were evil. God was punishing an evil heart. But we see that Haman had the same heart and attitude of unrighteousness and evil that his family had back in Canaan. And as a result, he had this hatred, this bitter hatred to kill the Jews. He made up in his heart and his mind to make this major decision. His major decision to kill the Jews was motivated on hate. His major decision was focused on unforgiveness and retaliation. But we too can become a victim of this attitude, where our major decision to bring harm on someone else is motivated by unforgiveness, resentment, and hatred. And I think before we make a major decision in our life, we should ask ourselves, am I making this decision out of hatred? What is motivating my decision? What is motivating me to make this major decision? Maybe this major decision means not to do anything at all. Because I'm being motivated by this hate and this resentment and this unforgiveness to bring harm on someone else. And thus also not bringing honor and glory to God. What is so crazy is this Haman guy, he's extremely, extremely wealthy. And he says to the king, if you let me kill these Jews, if you let me annihilate them and defeat them, I'll give you this ginormous amount of money. And so the king makes a decree in order to allow Haman and his men to destroy the Jews. In Esther chapter 3, it says this, Then Haman said to the king Xerxes, Is there a certain people dispersed among the people in all the province of the kingdom, who keeps themselves separate? Their customs are different from those of other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let us make a decree issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators of the royal treasury. He's willing to give 10,000 talents. So 10,000 years of work he's willing to put down in order to give to the king if he annihilates these people. That is a lot of money. So you can see what is fueling him. He's willing to pay this high price in order to defeat and destroy those of whom he hates. He wants to invest into destruction and death. He wants to oppose God, and he wants to destroy God's people. In this, we see that now Esther is in a difficult situation. She has a uncle, and she also has family members that are going to be killed because of this decree. What is extremely scary about this decree is after this decree was made, there's no way of undoing the decree. There's no way of canceling the decree after it's been made a decree in the Medo-Persian kingdom. So they have to live with that new law or decree that was put into place. But Mordecai finds out about this decree, and Mordecai is Esther's uncle. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing out loud bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gates, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. This is because they knew that this decree was going to annihilate and destroy them. They knew that there was no way of defending themselves against the royal army. For it was the royal army that had defeated them already once and had caused them to be slaves and captives in this land. And as a result, notice how Mordecai responds to Haman's plan. He responds to Haman's plan with bitter mourning, but it appears that he was not just mourning and sorrow, but he was also humbling himself before God in order to plead and cry out to God for help in the midst of this difficult situation. And from Mordecai's attitude of humility in the midst of this difficult situation, not only does he humble himself before God, but he also encourages other people, the other Jews, to humble themselves and go into a time of fasting and weeping and wailing and mourning before God. We also see this idea of humility and submission in the midst of mourning in the book of James. In James chapter 4, 7 through 8, it says this: "Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up." We see that the Jews humbled themselves before the Lord with grieving and mourning and wailing. We see that Mordecai humbled himself and submitted himself to God with weeping and mourning, because they knew that their deliverance wasn't going to come through them taking action, but it was going to only come through God, even though God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. We can see people acknowledging God and humbling themselves before God. And we can also see people completely rebelling against God and choosing a life of sin. Mordecai encourages Esther in chapter 4 to go to the king. And Esther chapter 4, 9 and 10 begins by saying this: "Hittith went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said." Hittith was a servant of Esther. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the kings and officials and all the people of the royal providence, that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courts without being summoned, the king has but one law: that they be put to death unless the king extends a golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." Mordecai asks Esther, "I want you to go to the king and plead on our behalf in order to save the Jews and to save our people." And Esther replies with a letter to Mordecai saying, "If I go to the king and I'm not invited, then there's a law, there's a decree that whoever comes to the king without being invited will be killed, will be destroyed." We see that she's trying to preserve her own life at the expense of the Jews. But notice what else takes place after this. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you, your father's family, will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." This is my favorite line in the entire book of Esther. This is my favorite verse in the entire book of Esther. because it reminds me of how God puts us in a place, even a day, in order to achieve the purpose and the desire of God. He puts fathers in position in order to bring deliverance and guidance to his family. He puts mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers into a position, a specific and purposeful position to bring deliverance and guidance to their family. God places people in as elders and deacons, as ministers, as evangelists, as teachers, as missionaries, for a specific purpose in order to accomplish a message of deliverance, guidance, and the will of God. And that is why we should all ask ourselves when we're in a difficult situation, maybe, just maybe, God has put us in the position that we're in right now for such a time as this. He was reminding them, Mordecai was reminding Esther that when we are faced with a big decision that could possibly bring deliverance and guidance and instruction to others, that we should acknowledge it as a part of the plan of God. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights, and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish." So she has an attitude that changes from trying to save her own life to an attitude that is willing to sacrifice her own life in order to spare, in order to possibly bring deliverance to God. She goes to she has an attitude of walking by sight, walking by the flesh. And then through the encouragement of Mordecai, she decides to walk by faith, knowing that very well she could possibly die. But she is willing to sacrifice her life in order to possibly bring deliverance to others. When I read this passage, I can't help but think of Jesus Christ. I can't help but think of how He died on the cross to bring deliverance to us so that we might possibly choose to accept the deliverance that God has for us, so we can experience eternal life and deliverance through Christ Jesus. In faith, Jesus went to the cross, hoping to bring deliverance to as many people as possible. And in the same way, Esther, in faith, chose to sacrifice her life in an act of faith in order to bring possible deliverance to her people. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. In this, Mordecai he encourages, and then he follows the plan and instruction of Esther. Esther calls on her husband, the king, and also encourages Haman to come to this banquet. And they both come to the banquet. And on the third day, Esther put her royal robe and stood in the inner courts of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw the Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. She was afraid that she was going to die if she approached the king. But we see that God has his hand on Esther, has his blessing and his favor on Esther, because she chose to sacrifice her life and to willingly follow after God in order to bring deliverance to his people in faith. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom I will give to you, if it pleases the king," replied Esther. "Let the king together with Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." After this, Haman and the king go to the banquet. And in this banquet, Esther wants to ask a favor of the king to deliver her people and to save her life along with the life of Mordecai. But she doesn't feel that it is the right time. She doesn't feel like it's the right time in order to speak up and make this decree, make this plea to the king to show mercy. So instead, she is led to ask the request to have another banquet the following day. And as a result, we see that not only is it now going to be God's timing for the deliverance, but also more will be unfolded and accomplished after this. After this banquet, the king goes and he lays down that night, and when he's trying to go to sleep, he cannot go to sleep, and he's read the story of the event, how Mordecai saved the king's life. And as a result, the king chooses to save Mordecai and reward him and bless him because he saved the king's life. And Haman, the one who hates Mordecai, Haman wants Mordecai to be killed, he chooses to set up a spy in order to kill Mordecai. He makes plans now to kill Mordecai out of this rage and this anger because he was humiliated when he honored Mordecai. All this is being orchestrated and set up by God, and we see that in this next banquet. Esther's second banquet, she encourages Haman and the king to join them. But in this situation, Esther chooses to make her plea to the king. She makes her plea to the king, and as a result, the king is infuriated to find out that Haman was plotting to kill his wife and was plotting to kill Mordecai, of which he honored, and was wanting to kill all of Esther's family. And as a result, Haman was arrested. And he was killed in the same way that he was plotting to kill Mordecai. And we see that God brought deliverance to these people. God brought deliverance to the Israelite people. Despite the fact that there was an evil king, despite there was a man named Haman that was making major decisions based off of hate and violence, because of the major decisions of Esther and Mordecai, God was able to bring deliverance because they realized that God had put them in a place and in a position in order to bring deliverance to God's people, before God. The original purpose of the book of Esther was to encourage the Israelite people to not give up on the deliverance of God, even when they are going through difficult times. And I would challenge all of us today to think about our next major decisions in life. And ask ourselves, before we make that major decision in life, how can I use the major decisions in my life to bring deliverance to the people of God? How can I use, what decisions can I make in my life in order to bring deliverance to my children, in order to bring deliverance to this lost person that I know, to bring deliverance to those who need to know God? 3 questions of application. The first one, do I let sinful desires affect my major decisions in life? Do I allow sin and hate and unforgiveness to motivate my major decisions in life? How will I focus on serving God and others in my major decisions? Will I focus on bringing blessing to others, or will I focus on bringing destruction on others? I would challenge us all to follow the pattern that we see in Esther and the pattern that we see in Jesus Christ by focusing on living a life that brings deliverance and blessing to others. Third, how will I humble myself before God before making my next major decision?